This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 333rd episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I like to say that every part of the writing process is wonderful in its own way, and it's true for the most part. Conception, outlining, drafting, revising, they'll all engage different parts of the brain and require different skill sets that are challenging and engaging in their own way. But I do have to admit that the tweaking part of editing is probably my least favorite. Once it gets to that point where I'm just line editing here and there there isn't a ton of creativity involved, I usually find myself starting to get a little antsy. That's where I'm at right now in finishing up initial edits on my historical superhero work in progress, Wayfarer. I'm on my second to last cleanup edit before setting it to my critique partners. Overall, I'm really happy with how it's come together, so there isn't a ton of creative work left at this point. That's a good thing, but it also means I'm itching to finish and move on to something more creative. The latest post on my blog is Learn to Write Deep and Rich Story Conflict. Do you want to take your story conflict beyond mere altercations to a plot-advancing catalyst? To find out the 3 important questions you should be asking about your conflict, visit my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast entitled 5 Ways to Trim Your Book's Word Count, Part 2 of 2. For every author desperate to cull a novel's out-of-control word count, there's another author who insists every word is precious. After all, a book wouldn't have turned out long if it didn't need to be long. Sometimes that's true. If Charles Dickens had whacked away at his word count, not that he would, since he was paid by the installment, we would never have enjoyed such sprawling delights as Bleak House, Dombey and Son. If modern-day wordsmiths, such as fantasy maestro Patrick Rothfuss, hadn't been turned loose upon the page, we would never get to sample the luxurious delights of his 800-plus page Kingkiller explorations. In short, there's a time and a place for hefty word counts. But there's also a reason we still quote that pithy proverb, brevity is the soul of wit. So here's the bottom line. Whether the end result of your book be long or short, every word must exist for a consciously sought and approved reason. As we discussed last week in part 1, there are several good reasons for wanting to cull word count. Not least among those reasons is simply making the book better. What author doesn't desire that? Last week I showed you 5 ways to edit your book's word count on the macro level by evaluating your subplots, characters, scenes, sequels, and explanations. If you followed my advice, you probably already found large chunks of your book that you could easily streamline. Today, we're going to take that a step farther, and I'm going to show you how you can up your word chopping game and revise your way to a better story by focusing on micro editing. So once you've whacked all the big, obvious junk from your story, you can start focusing on the not-so-obvious stuff. Since I had very little macro stuff I could cut from my historical superhero work in progress, Wayfarer, micro-editing was my only hope for trimming my gargantuan 200,000-word first draft. It can be overwhelming to look at your mountain of a first draft and know you're going to have to somehow tunnel through it using mainly spoons, aka one word at a time. But it's surprising how much unnecessary filler exists on the sentence level. Using only the 5 methods that we're going to talk about here, I cut 40,000 words from my manuscript. Not too shabby. So the first thing you're going to want to look for is glue words. As I was preparing to start this post, word player Jerry Ann Fisher serendipitously messaged me on Facebook asking if I'd ever done a post on sticky sentences. As per an article on Pro Writing Aid, sticky sentences are ones containing a high percentage of glue words. Glue words are the 200 or so most common words in English, excluding the personal pronouns. Glue words are generally used to link nouns, verbs, adverbs, and adjectives. In short, these are words that simply don't add much to the story. Following is the list I used for Wayfarer's edit. Asked, began, beginning, breath, could, exhale, feel, felt, glance, glanced, glancing, hear, inhale, just, look, words ending in ly, moment, replied, said, see, saw, seeing, seemed. Words ending in self, his self, herself, yourself, myself, itself. Smell, sound, start, taste, that, think, thought, thinking, touch, turn, vary, and wonder. So run a universal find replace through your document and replace every instance of these words with the same word, all in caps. This will force you to actively notice and consider each instance of the word instead of skimming over it obliviously. Note that not every instance of these words will be superfluous or incorrect, but you'll find you can trim at least several hundred of these glue words from every chapter. That's a sizable deduction over the entirety of a book. Your story will be the stronger for it. Number 2, sticky filler. Stickiness can infiltrate your book beyond solitary words. You also need to watch out for sticky filler phrases. Usually these phrases are the result of saying it twice where once would do. They include 2 descriptors. For example, her hair was golden, like the sun, like corn silk. You don't need 2 of them. You can get rid of like corn silk. 2 action beats, or an action beat and a dialogue tag. For example, he nodded and took a swig from the bottle. I know what you mean, he said. That can become, he took a swig from the bottle. I know what you mean. Mechanics of emotion. For example, he shrugged his shoulders can become he shrugged. He clapped his hands can become he clapped. She reached her hand for the jar on the top shelf can become simply she reached for the jar on the top shelf. He reached to poke her can become he poked her. She sat down and he stood up can become she sat and he stood. 3. Repetitive dialogue. For example, talking around the subject. Dialogue is one of those things you can't outline, which means even when you know the shape of a conversation before writing it, you still have to find your way through the give and take of the actual conversation's evolution, which means that most character conversations end up a little more rambly than they need to be. What you need to do is examine each of your dialogue scenes. Locate the heart of the conversation. What is the one red-hot point the scene is working toward? Now, go back and make sure all the dialogue leading up to that point is funneling right to it. You can also try to eliminate repetition. In Wayfarer, I had one important dialogue scene that needed to cover a lot of ground. Pretty much everything the character said was important, but it wasn't well organized. Instead of resolving one point before moving on, I had let the conversation jump to another important topic, then circle back around to the previous topic. To combat this, I divided my chapter into subfiles in Scrivener and labeled each file with its section subject within the conversation. Then I rearranged the pieces so the flow of the conversation was more cohesive, which kept the characters from having to unnecessarily repeat themselves. And finally, you can also chop dialogue fillers. Story dialogue is not like real life dialogue. It doesn't have to hem and haw. It doesn't need fillers for the sake of realism. So cut words such as ah, huh, well, what, and you know. But in trimming dialogue, be careful not to endanger the voice of individual characters. Sometimes the right way to say something is not the way a particular character would actually say it. For example, my Cockney sidekick character has the dialogue tick of ending many of her statements as a question. It would have required fewer words to drop the tick, but it wouldn't have been true to the character. Number 4, repetitive narrative. Just like dialogue, the narrative you write when in the stage of figuring out your story can end up walking a drunken line. Watch out for places where you, 1, repeat the same information in the same scene, as in my circling back example that I talked about a minute ago under repetitive dialogue. 2, repeat the same information multiple times throughout the book. For example, an important story might be recounted to more than one character. 3, repeat the character's feelings or motivations over and over again without evolving them. 5, contextual overkill. Finally, watch out for pieces of informative dialogue and narrative that are rendered unnecessary by the context. Here's a paragraph I deleted from Wayfarer. As always, the words were out before he properly considered them. Was he 10 kinds of fool? All these questions aside, this was his chance. Right here in this room, everything he'd ever wanted from life was coming true in an instant. He would never gain another patron such as Mr. Maddock. The man had been nothing but solicitous and forthright with him from the moment they met. This is a nice little chunk of 70 words, all of which are unnecessary because readers will already either know or be able to deduce the characters' realizations and motivations thanks to the overall context of these and preceding scenes. Figuring out how to trim your book's word count probably isn't going to be your favorite writing chore, but armed with these methods for macro and micro word trimming, you can cut tens of thousands of unnecessary words from your story. Even if your book isn't grossly overweight, all these tricks will help you turn out a tighter, more streamlined, better story. So, happy trimming. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.